the disappearances, murders, and violence experienced by Indigenous women, girls, 2S LGBTQIA people, and this is genocide.
Tonight, the inquiry comes to a close as families of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls hear the truths they've been speaking for decades.
It makes people uncomfortable. I'm a good Canadian, right? If you don't do that, yeah, you do.
And Quebec gets special attention from the National Inquiry. Good evening. Welcome to APTN National News. I'm Dennis Ward.
And I'm Melissa Ridgen. The National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls wrapped up today in Gatineau, Quebec. The much anticipated final report concluded that violence against Indigenous women is genocide. Amber Bernard was at the closing ceremony.
The inquiry handed over its final report to Prime Minister Trudeau. The lengthy document, over 1,200 pages, cost $92 million over the span of 3 years. It urges all levels of society, from government to everyday Canadians, to actively work against what the report calls genocidal racism, colonialism, and violence against Indigenous women and girls.
To eradicate their existence as nations, communities, families, and individuals is the cause of the disappearances, murders, and violence experienced by Indigenous women, girls, 2S LGBTQIA people, and this is genocide.
Some of the calls for justice are: we call upon the federal government to include cases where there is a pattern of intimate partner violence and abuse as murder in the first degree under Section 222 of the Criminal Code. It asks Canadians to confront and speak out against racism, sexism, ignorance, homophobia, and transphobia, and teach or encourage others to do the same wherever it occurs, in your home, in your workplace, or in social settings. And requests the creation of an independent civilian body to oversee the investigations of any conflicts that arise with Indigenous people and public services. In 2016, the Liberal government launched the National Inquiry and plans to conduct a thorough review of the final report.
Indigenous women and girls across Canada have disappeared, suffered violence, or been killed, and our justice system has failed them. Sadly, this is not simply a relic of our past. To this day, the safety, security, and dignity of Indigenous mothers, daughters, sisters, and friends are routinely threatened.
Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says his government will implement a national action plan to address violence against Indigenous women and girls. Amber Bernard, APTN National News, Gatineau, Quebec.
It was a who's who of Indigenous leaders and stakeholders in the audience. Everyone seemed to be happy with the final product. The only sour note was the Prime Minister not using the word genocide in his speech, but as Todd Lamourand reports, one individual traveled a long way to be there.
Gladys Raddick calls it her war pony, and it brought her thousands of kilometers to end up parked in front of the Museum of History. She, for one, was happy with the report and its calls for justice.
Yes, it was, because the families' voices were clearly heard. Canada's dirtiest little secret is out now.
The nearly 3-hour ceremony had its share of colorful moments, but also ones of somber reflection, remembering the ones who are no longer here. Cheryl Maloney was pleased with the day's events.
And letting Canadian governments know that this isn't acceptable, the way our women are being treated.
She wasn't bothered that Prime Minister Trudeau didn't use the word genocide in his speech.
I'm more worried about what all the political parties say and what political will is going to come out of this, whether they're in power or in opposition or a backbencher. I'm looking at this as a challenge for Canadians, Canadian governments, and Canadian representatives.
The 231 recommendations don't faze Senator Murray Sinclair. He sees similarities with the TRC and Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples recommendations.
So what that should tell people is that every major study that's ever been done on the relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in this country agrees upon the direction of the solution. And so now we should just get to it.
Radek hopes Trudeau will honor his words.
That's the one hope that I do have, is that he honors the words. I'm looking forward to hearing about this national action plan that he's claimed that he's going to work on.
Another interesting aspect of this report is we still don't know exactly how many murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls there is. The estimate coming into today was 1,200, and that's still the number quoted in the executive summary of the report. Paul Lamrand, APTN National News, Gatineau, Quebec.
And we'll have more on Gladys Radek's trip to Gatineau later in the show. The National Inquiry also released a report specific to Quebec, its institutions and systemic problems. Lindsay Richardson has that story.
For me, when we travel, it was obvious that I didn't know my own history.
Commissioner Michelle Odette has long tried to balance identities as an Indigenous woman living in Quebec.
I was taught that we were savages, barbares. Nobody taught me that I was a proud Innu and a proud Québécoise. Did you learn that?
A reality so long overlooked that the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls Commission also unveiled a Quebec-specific report and an additional 21 calls for justice, imploring the province's institutions, government, and society to learn from their mistakes.
They made an apology, but we want action. We have solutions in the report.
The final report quickly created division in Quebec. Assembly of First Nations Regional Chief Ghislain Picard tweeted about French media's lack of coverage of the closing ceremony, and one La Presse columnist criticized the inquiry's use of the term genocide.
I mean, 145 million, and we are now 4.9% of the population. You know, we are almost wiped out. That's a genocide. But people, for whatever reason, they don't want to acknowledge that.
The separate report addresses historical, linguistic, and systemic barriers token to Quebec. One of the most pervasive, Nakasset says, is indifference.
It makes people uncomfortable. I'm a good Canadian, right? If you don't do that, yeah, you do.
The report also takes aim at a lack of cultural awareness in Quebec's justice system, recommending the hiring of more Indigenous workers and that the government establish an inquiry on children taken from Indigenous families. But a lack of response from Premier François Legault has some people worried.
What it appears to me is that they're reluctant. The reluctance, I mean, why wouldn't they embrace it and say, okay, you know, we get it, we understand it. It's because it's kind of like trying to not take ownership of what has happened. You know, it's always this shying away from the truth.
168 pages of truth that many say can no longer be ignored. Lindsay Richardson, APTN National News, Montreal.
In Winnipeg, local grassroots organizations came together to create a safe space for families to view today's ceremonies. Many reflected on the inquiry's findings and what the 231 calls for justice mean to them. Here's APTN's Brittany Hobson.
Manitoba families came together for an emotional conclusion to the nearly 3-year-long national inquiry. The day was about support. Jasmine Smith is one of the coordinators of the event. She says families are filled with mixed emotions.
Glad that it's over, glad to see some of the results of the report. Sad, you know, missing their loved ones. There's lots of family members that don't have that closure. So being able to experience that in a safe place with other people that understand the grief, I think is very important.
One of those family members is Betty Rourke. Her sister, Jennifer Johnston, was killed in 1980. Later, Rourke's daughter, who was named after her sister, was also killed. In 2013, Jennifer McPherson was killed in BC by her partner, Trago Andretti. Police would later determine Andretti was also guilty of killing Myrna Latondra, who went missing in 2006. Her remains were found in a Winnipeg rooming house. Rourke believes her daughter would be alive if police took Latondra's case seriously.
The police would have done their job. He wouldn't have even been on the street. My daughter would never have met him.
Rourke testified at hearings in Winnipeg where she criticized the way police treat Indigenous women. a sentiment she still believes today.
Some of us are mothers, grandmothers, great-grandmothers, sisters, aunts, cousins, friends, but no, they don't treat us that way. They just don't treat us that way. They treat us as if we deserved to get what happened to us.
In the final report, there are 25 recommendations relating to the justice system, one of them being an automatic first-degree murder charge for intimate partner violence. This was the case in McPherson's death, but not Latondra's. Rourke hopes to see this in all cases.
Is that something that you think should be put into place?
Oh, yes, definitely.
Brittany Hobson, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
In Vancouver, survivors, families of the missing and murdered, and advocates gathered to support each other and give their opinions on the final report of the National Inquiry. APTN's Tina House has their story.
Genocide of Indigenous women and girls is the final conclusion for the Murdered and Missing Women and Girls National Inquiry's final report.
This public outing of the fact that Indigenous people across Turtle Island are in fact targeted by the genocide comes as no surprise to Indigenous communities, as they have had to fight every day for hundreds of years to stay alive.
And those words reverberated across this room as family members, advocates, and leaders gathered in Vancouver at this press conference.
I feel for all the families today, all the families across this country. The ones who testified, the ones who didn't get to testify because it was too hard.
LORELEI Williams testified at the National Inquiry about her aunt Belinda Williams, who's been missing since 1978, and her cousin Tanya Holick's DNA was found on Robert Picton's farm in 2002. Mount Pleasant MLA Melanie Mark brought her 8-year-old daughter to the event and says that the murdered and missing women and girls are now finally being heard through this report.
We need to acknowledge the truth that is going on in this country, and that is what today is about, is affirmation to the family members and their courage to just never give up, fighting for justice. And it's poignant that the inquiry talks about a call to justice, that we're talking about basic human rights.
Today marks a milestone, but we're not home yet by a long shot. And now we need enough talk, enough consultation. Now we need results.
LORELEI's dance group she founded, called Butterflies and Spirits, performed with JB, the First Lady, to honor all the murdered and missing. Tina House, APTN National News, Vancouver.
There was much to react to as the inquiry wrapped up. We have more of that coming up after the break.
And we'll get the latest on the fire situation in Pekanjicum.
Welcome back. Many travel great distances to witness the final report from the National Inquiry, including a well-known advocate from northern British Columbia. Our reporter Charlotte Moore-Jacobs road tripped with Gladys Raddick as she made her way from Terrace, British Columbia to Gatineau, Quebec. We showed you part 1 on Friday. Here now is part 2.
Gladys Raddick is leaving Terrace, British Columbia on her very last trip across the country. She's going to witness the final report for the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls.
I think going to Ottawa to the big house and delivering our voices to them is important. It's an important step towards positive change.
She's traveled on foot and by car across Canada 7 times. And has seen many things.
We had quite a few incidents with racism, with perpetrators, guys following us, recording us. And, it was scary. And the other scary part too was the fact that a lot of our walkers too were also finding items of clothing, sweaters, bras, panties, change purses.
And has given many recommendations, like the ones she shared at the inquiry hearings in Smithers, BC. Some things in her area have improved, like public transportation. But there are constant reminders that most things haven't. Since those hearings in northern BC, 2 women have been found dead and 1 has gone missing from Smithers. Chantel Simpson, Jessica Patrick, and Frances Brown.
Where she was lost, there was no...
Recognized by her auntie here. Constant reminders that things must change is why Radek keeps fighting. We're stopped again in Morristown, BC.
We're safe now, and we're talking about it, and that's what needs to be done.
Yeah.
And don't hitchhike anymore. Okay.
We dropped by Kikwanda, BC to meet Wanda Good, an old friend and fellow MMIWG advocate.
There is no more feelings of safety. There is no more feelings of closure or healing because these cases have never been solved.
Her cousin Lana Derrick went missing in 1995, and her cousin Alberta Williams was found dead in 1989, both along the Highway of Tears. Good wants all levels of government to address factors that make Indigenous women vulnerable.
When I hear of another First Nations woman who has gone missing, I think of the mountain that we are trying to move.
It's been a long trip from Terrace. We're near Edson, Alberta, when a wildfire closes the highway and forces us to drive through the night deep in the bush. But Radek is determined to make this trip to represent the families. Like Doug Leslie, who we meet in Burns Lake. His 15-year-old daughter, Lorna Leslie, was found murdered on a logging road north of Vanderhoof in BC in 2010.
For the first 7 or so years, I wrote to Lauren every single day on Facebook. Now I plan on writing a book with all the posts that helped me get through the 7 years. And hopefully it'll maybe help somebody else get through their 7 years.
In Saskatoon, we meet up with Myrna LaPlante. Her aunt Emily Osmond LaPlante and nephew Cody Wolf went missing from Saskatchewan. She hopes the inquiry prompts changes with the RCMP.
When we realize a person has gone missing, is contacting the police. And we need absolute respect and honor from the police, that it doesn't matter who they are, that the appropriate resources are there and the dedication to finding the missing person.
Despite what you may think of the inquiry, Radek wants to make one point clear.
I think about those commissioners and I think about how long it took me to learn all these stories. It took me 11 years, and they were given 2.5 years to learn those stories, to hear them, to learn them, and to figure out what can we do to change things.
But it's time to leave. There's still a lot of highway and a lot more fight left to go.
It's not the inquiry, it's not the families that need to listen, it's Canada. And by golly, I think they will.
Charlotte Moore-Jacobs, APTN National News, Saskatoon.
Indigenous communities in parts of this country continue to cope with wildfires. We're going to check in with one after the break.
And a big celebration kicks off at Shoal Lake 40. Stick around.
Welcome back. Officials say about 2,000 people fled their homes in Pikangikum First Nation as a forest fire continues to grow and burn out of control. Evacuees are now being taken to Winnipeg. The community has been under evacuation since Thursday, just a day after the forest fire was reported about 3 kilometers away. A change in the wind is expected to send more smoke into Pakanjikam today. The province says more fire crews have been sent, and the blaze has now grown to almost 4,000 hectares.
They're also focusing a lot on values protection, which is, again, sprinklering buildings, outbuildings, anything that you really, don't want to catch on fire, basically. And what that does is when you put a sprinkler in an area spraying around, it creates a sort of a zone of humidity that makes it difficult for embers or sparks to light up any sort of the fine fuels that might be on the building or around the building.
A once isolated First Nation community in northwestern Ontario is getting ready to celebrate a major milestone. Over a century ago, Shoal Lake 40 First Nation was cut off from mainland so Winnipeg could have drinking water. Now a new road is helping to right that wrong. APTN's Martha Troyan has that story.
It's called Freedom Road because it now connects Shoal Lake 40 with the Trans-Canada Highway. The community, home to 700 people, is located on Shoal Lake, the source of Winnipeg's drinking water. Over a century ago, the community was cut off from the mainland in order for the aqueduct to be built. Even though this community is the source of clean drinking water for Winnipeg, people here have been unable to drink what comes out of their own taps for years.
What Freedom Road means to our community, it's life, it's freedom, it's all those things. It's a 100-year-old story that we've been fighting for, all with our access to our community. Our lands were taken, stolen, and made us into a man-made island and had to live in unacceptable conditions.
After much delay and political ping-pong, this 24-kilometer year-round unrestricted road will provide residents access to essential goods and pave the way for increased infrastructure and economic opportunities, including a new water treatment facility.
We're about peoples of solutions, and we've demonstrated that with Freedom Road. Freedom Road is a tripartite project, First Nation led. Our people's always been collaborative and want to be true partners as intended in our treaties. So that's who we are as peoples, and we demonstrate that with Freedom Road.
Freedom Road was cost shared by the federal government, the province of Manitoba, and the city of Winnipeg. Now the community is ready to celebrate the end of that forced isolation. Community celebrations are taking place all week with fish fries, helicopter rides, and live bands. Martha Troyan, APTN National News, Winnipeg.
And a huge congrats to the people of Shoal Lake 40. We were out there on Friday, and the mood in the community is
I would imagine.
Yeah, it's great to see. And
only took 100 years.
Yeah, 4 days of celebrations this week. And that's your APTN National News for this Monday. If you missed anything from today's National Inquiry coverage, be sure to check out our website, aptnnews.ca.
We will continue to bring you coverage in the days ahead as the report is dissected and digested. I'm Melissa Ridgen.
And I'm Dennis Ward. Have a great night. See you back here tomorrow.